forward. There we go.
Okay. So it's funny, even as I said, nice to meet you, it occurs to me, like, I guess we can now call virtual encounters meeting now, right? I think we're at that point. I guess we have to, because so much of this takes place at a distance. If we didn't presume that, then we would have to confess that we never met each other at all. So I guess this has to count as meeting.
Exactly. You know, it's funny because I actually, I think what you're saying is really deep. Just the fact that we can't quite tell whether to call this meeting or not. Yet there's something going on that wasn't going on 10 years ago that all of a sudden is going on everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't even know if we know at all what we're doing or what this means.
Boy, do I echo that. I sure don't. I have to admit, though, that this, what you and I are now doing, and this is only the beginning of my exposure to this disquisitive arena of the internet that John has commended me to. But I have to admit, kind of in spite of myself, really, that it's forcing me to relitigate some of the apprehensions I've had about online discourse writ large, because I've been so wary of it, because I find it's there's this interesting thing that happened, I think, in the last decade or so, whereby, formerly, I'm kind of simplifying this a little bit, I suppose, but formerly it's almost as though there were sort of two different kinds of arenas of discourse. One which was casual and unpolished and spontaneously social, and another that was more rigorous and reflective and refined. And that was sort of the published media, right? Published discourse. Not to say that it was all of great quality, but it had to go through a certain amount of, it had to be put through a filter of a certain amount of editorial reflection in order to then emerge within the public sphere. And it seems to me that what the event of social media did is take these two arenas and just collapse them together. So all of a sudden, everything we do in this virtual landscape is published, in effect. So all of these casual social discourses, which are often bumbling and fraught with mistakes and fraught with a certain amount of social clumsiness and improvisation, all of a sudden are lifted to this publishable medium.
Right.
And the collapsing of those two worlds is something that I think perhaps we were not prepared for, and we're still trying to negotiate through it. And I have to say, these conversations that you've been having, and with John and with all of these other interlocutors, are probably the first example I have seen whereby the collapsing together of those two worlds has availed itself in service of knowing, in service of something valuable. It is the first time I've seen it, which is not to say it's the first time it's happened, because, goodness knows, I don't see everything.
Yeah.
But that alone just impresses me. It's not sure what to do with it.
Right. I think the thing, the sense of reflection and impression that you're expressing, there's a way in which there's something going on that's different. And there's an awareness of, what I'm hearing you say is, there's an awareness of something that used to happen historically, but only happened privately, and it took a lot for it to happen publicly, if you could get it there. And once it was public, it was so framed in a sense that the awareness of being in the public was integral to the message, right?
Right.
And then all of a sudden you're saying, what does it mean to have a clumsy conversation that was always already presupposed as private on some pretty much every respect,
right,
to be in a moment be broadcasted literally for everyone's consumption in the moment, but then to have that moment to be able to be played over again through history at anybody's own. This is other dimension, which is really interesting, is that it's not TV, right? Where you could miss it, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's not like an event. It's a a record of conversations that historically have always been this enactment, right?
Right.
Of anything, because that's the thing about conversation is I don't even know what I'm going to say. That's what makes it private, I would imagine, because public is always like, you know, you had a speech or you had some kind of presentation, or at least you controlled the scene enough, right? To be in consideration that you knew what you were going to say, so you can manage the listening or like speak into the listening or something. But here we are.
That's right. No, exactly. And what you say about it sort of being, it sort of has this now recurrence across time.
Yeah.
It kind of demands that we relinquish the control and the management of it in the way that we otherwise would have.
Exactly.
And it no longer belongs to us, or sort of we have to give it up. We have to offer it up, I suppose. There's a certain amount of offering ourselves up and it up in service of whatever it then is subsumed into.
Totally. And the it, right, that we're offering up is still quite mysterious to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then how it it's so interesting. It's like not only this particular instance of it, but then the string of its that coalesce into something of a broader scale. These pocket discourses that quite obviously are becoming threaded together and enmeshed within something of a gestalt view that of course we can't see, being so embedded within it. But I find it humbling in a way that I actually find really helpful, because it's so complex, because the picture hasn't really revealed itself to us yet. And I mean, maybe won't in any kind of comprehensive way, right? Perhaps by definition, it can't. And that, I think, in terms of assuming some very, very, very modest role within this unfolding picture, kind of is helpful, because it disabuses any sense of self-importance in the matter. It's like it's like offering yourself up to a teamed activity whose destination is unknown, but is intrinsically meaningful by virtue of identifying with the discourse, becoming the discourse and losing yourself within it, and then having it pour back into you in such a way that you play but a role, but then you kind of take it on in full. Anyway, I find that sort of the way it sort of disarms the egocentrism that people usually bring to such things is helpful, very helpful.
Yeah. Well, I know John and I talked about this in our first interview where he was talking about this. There's a new kind of vulnerability, right?
Yes.
That I can actually have something that I share my mind in this a spontaneous way, and we have this interaction, right? And that other people can watch it, and then they can come to me, and I have this awareness of they know me so much, way more about me. I don't even know their name.
Right.
There is a certain kind of like new kind of vulnerability that I don't think was possible, except for maybe, not even that like movie stars maybe experience that, but in such a constrained way, in a certain sense, because it's like so much is revealed in the spontaneous, whatever calls to speech, like the way we listen, what occurs to us, what our attention goes to, like how we're affected by each other. You think about like what I often, this is what excites me about this, right? Because I think what we're doing is right now, and what I've been doing and what John's been doing on the internet. In other words, these long form meandering conversations, right? These discourses that build on each other, right? That other people have and talk about their other discourses that they watched, right? This is one of the few places where it feels to me, or I don't know if it does feel to me, but I also wonder if this is one of the places where technology actually brings forward something that cannot be technologicalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can't be. It's the thing. One of the reasons why I think circling has really come to being is that it highlights the intersubjective I-thou relationship. And
Right.
that happens to be one of the places that it doesn't seem like you can enframe it in the Heideggerian sense.
Right.
I
Right.
can't know you through optimizing you,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Or looking at you, or having a bunch, or being informed by you. I know you by being in some way changed, right? In the thing called understanding you, I alter my understanding of myself to greater, lesser degrees. But that's how we got our identity, right? Is in this
Right.
sense. So what does it mean when you think about it to have these very deep dialogues, right? Long form, no one knows what's going to happen or the outcome is going to be. And you get to listen, like people get to listen to people
Yeah.
having very deep thoughts. And you go, thinking and listening are so coupled because you can't think and listen at the same time.
Oh, I heard you say that, I think, in a conversation you had with Paul, and it just, what a beautiful way of putting it. That's exactly right. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's what you were describing about meeting people and having them know you, having this sort of an asymmetrical relationship, right? Perhaps when you meet someone that has been observing you on these videos, as I have been, for instance. And up until the point of actually meeting, there's an asymmetrical knowing, because you're known perhaps without knowing the other person. Or conversely, if you're simply watching someone on this platform, you're knowing without also being known. And there's a sense in which you cannot know, in the sense that I think we both mean know. You cannot know without being known, right? There's an essential and indispensable mutuality to the processual knowing that I think that this is in service of.
Yeah.
And that kind of mutuality, that requited love, you were talking about it in terms of a love affair, which I thought was beautiful and apt, because that's exactly what it is, right? And I think typically the way we interface with technology is in a very unrequited fashion. Because of the way we relate to it, it is quite one-sided. I think like the digital age has us all cast as unrequited lovers or something like that, right? It's unconsummated eros, if I can use that metaphor, because it's not deeply reciprocal. And typically when we enter into these discourses before this particular arena, I think, emerged, you would find that you weren't necessarily, I mean, you could engage to some degree, but you were always at a distance because you were never produced through the discourse. You were never really changed as a consequence of it, except maybe by becoming more abbreviated than you were before, right?
Yeah.
If only in your own estimation. There was a degree to which you were less than as a consequence of the discourse, because of the way I think interactions via technology, especially with social media, consist of branding rather than substantial contact, right? You're holding something of yourself aloft for view.
Right.
And there's a certain idolatrous nature to that. Because you're not playing, it's like it lacks the play. John said that to me about these conversations. He said the way that he's reckoned it is by entering into a state of play, right? Which is a very symbolic way of relating to the medium and relating through the medium, right? Because then your self within the medium is simply something that you offer up in service of the spontaneous production that should occur to it as it interlocutes with other selves, right? That you're offering yourself up to know and to be known in such a way that you identify with the knowing.
Right.
And that's also what I mean by it being very unegocentric, because there's a certain naturalized humility to the whole process, right? Because there has to be, because you could be remade in virtue of it. Yeah. And if you're entering into it perhaps authentically, that in fact is that's the formal cause, right? Is to be remade by it, rather than simply to present yourself and to be to be read in a particular way.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that your thoughtfulness on this is just so, as I was listening to you, I was just noticing myself going, taking deep breaths, like certain moments of things happening over here and listening to you. And I just want to say that, like, one of the things I really wanted to ask you about, because I was really struck by your conversation, by you with your conversation with Paul Vanderklay. By a number of things. Like, first of all, the sense of your relationship to this discourse and everything that this discourse points to seemed so deeply respectful. But when I think respect, spectacle is connected with re-seeing, to read, right? And there's a quality of just like a deep, just a deep respect and almost an awareness of as if something was almost private, right, about it, right? Like that kind of personal sense of it. That was my felt sense, and why I really just loved hearing your conversation, and just in all these ways in which you just express this deep humility, yet at the same time, what it seemed like that humility gave access to were a combination of precision and poesis that really hit me like poetry on a number of things. And one of the specific things I got so interested to find out more about was the way that you talked about this experience of working with John, in the progression of yourself in that relationship. I don't know if you used the word apprenticeship.
I did, yeah, I think so, yeah.
But I really got this sense of something so rare, because people don't apprentice anymore to other people, and what that even means. But my understanding, because my grandfather, who had a huge influence on my life, apprenticed with a tailor for a couple of years while he lived outside in order to do it, to escape his family of 17 brothers and sisters, so he wouldn't get caught just working on the farm, right? So he escaped and lived in a park and apprenticed with this tailor for 2 years. And he would tell so many stories of what it was like being there, being in the atmosphere with the master tailor. And my sense of it was that most of what the deep transformation of what it was to become a tailor in your being, right, was a being thing. And that very small amounts of it had to do, or the time was when he was teaching him directly how to sew. He said most of it was eating lunch with him, hanging out with him in silence, the way that he talked to his wife, the way he answered the door, that there was so much participation at this deep way that had histories of tailors in the past, right? A legacy of the way that they moved his hands and the knuckles, and like the way he put things away, how he responded to things. That there was this sense that you could really tell that my grandfather's reverence in these stories was such a deep transformative experience of apprenticeship. And I really felt that sense as you were describing your journey with John in a deep way.
Wow. Yeah. Guy, first of all, there's so much of what you said that I want to respond to. I'm trying to just order it. Well, thank you. First of all, you're very kind, and without simply appearing to return a compliment for its own sake, I have to say that much of what you said of me is mutual, especially insofar as the poesis is concerned, because I think that you're one of the few people I've ever heard speak that exemplifies in speech, in the manner of speech, what you're conveying in the object of the speech. Just the way in that beautiful Heideggerian way, and you evoke that while always being intelligible. And I find your speech extremely resituating and perspectively stirring, if I can use that, borrow that from John. So I really mean that. I've been just as enriched by listening to you for that very reason. So thank you.
Thank you. Received.
The apprenticeship with John, I think that what it has revealed to me, that particular relationship, is that the intellectual apprenticeship and the social and emotional apprenticeship, when figured properly, are inextricable. And I think that has given rise to my understanding of what philosophia actually is, that it's not dispassionate, and it's not in any way dissociated from our embodied behavior or our fundamental attitudes towards that behavior, right? It's integrative and integral, right? That it somehow threads us together and gives us inward coherence so that we might be outwardly harmonious, right? That's the whole idea of it and the practice of it. And that, you mentioned the relation of the I and the thou. That, to me, in many ways, is, in a very pithy way, probably the most apt way of formulating what its countenance and its expression actually is in practice. That I thou is somehow it's trying to get this right. I thou is it's as though I thou is the relation that symbolizes realization, if I can put it that way, right?
I thou is the relation that
symbolizes realization, right? And in the same way, it's I thou is also, I think, the native expression of what we mean by a symbolized self that is relational in such a way, in that participatory way. And so I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, especially when you mentioned this idea of a love affair with the process, which I find so resonant, precisely because I think one way of understanding philosophia, and this is all relevant to what you asked about John, because it's everything that I have absorbed and I think gained by my friendship with John, among others, but certainly John.
I like the word absorbed.
Yeah, because it's like there's a permeability, right? There's like a membranous quality, right? That to the interaction. But this idea that philosophia is about what we do with our eros, right? It is the arrangement of our loves for knowing, right? And that's why the Platonic discourses, the ta erotica for Socrates, features so prominently, and that's why philia sophia, right? It's embedded within the term itself, that somehow philosophia, to be more specific, is like, this is going to sound very abstruse, but I trust you'll be generous, because you are very generous. It's like I thou. Philosophia is the impregnation of the self with thou by means of a tutored and tuned eros, right? And then the consequent pregnancy is what is tended by the symbolic role of the sage, right? That's why Socrates is referred to as the midwife, right? That somehow the discourse is a way of birthing the self into its parturition, and the role of the sage, philosophically, is to nurture and tend to the impregnation and the birth. I think Heidegger said that something like that too about dialectic, that the dialect, the self is, or maybe the subject, I can't remember the words he used, but that the subject produces itself in the care of the dialectic, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like a passage through a birth canal through which one has to travel. And that's why it's a cultivation of eros, by embedding it within a communitas that orients it properly, that lifts its gaze to matters of ultimacy, right? So I think that understanding that this arrangement of loves, that is something that both by in his exemplification, but also explanation of philosophia that I gained from John, and then that's just been conjured again and again and again by the nature of the relationship and the friendship, which I feel I'm evolving through, and I would say that of a handful of close, intimate friendships that do that, all of those, that's their fun. It's like I somehow feel as though I am composed of my most intimate friends and friendships. I'm somehow composed of of a handful of conversations that they're provenant of personality in some sense. You know what I mean? Do you ever feel that way? Like I simply am the product of a handful of interlocutors that I keep producing through.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that
such a beautiful.
So that beautiful. Sorry, yeah, I've run on a tangent now, Guy. Please save me.
Well, what I really enjoy, I'm enjoying about what you're saying is this sense of finding. Well, one, you're not reporting on something, right? On some level, obviously, you've gone over these ideas like over and over and over and over again, and probably will for a lifetime, right?
Yeah.
And as you're speaking them, they come to being in your speaking, right? Such that I say something, you're like, oh, whoa, I've been immersed. I just want to appreciate the sense of formation that kind of opens with your speech that I find myself in. I was just going like, whoa, especially when you said the thing about being a product or a conglomeration of these key people conversations, these births of, because I very much feel the same way. In fact, I could tell the story of my life about just simply walk through this, describe those relationships, and you'll end up with me.
Right. That's exactly right. Yes.
And this is one of the things about I sense it's kind of like, as I'm talking right now, and you really have this quality too, and this compels me. It's like I'm on one level, I'm about to think and I'm about to say something, right? But there's this quality where I'm more listening. Like I'm more kind of listening. I don't know to what exactly, but I'll find out what I'm thinking. I'll find out and then there's the quality of where on some level I would imagine all of the faces of all of those people that I've had just so deep mentorships with, right? Who've mentored me. In many ways, structure whatever it is that I'm thinking. Like there's this kind of structural element of thought of where, and this is what I appreciate a lot about what's happening with YouTube, and that these conversations are available and that people are interested in them, because to listen is some thoughts you could only hear, or in other words, genuinely think in order to think them, in order to hear them, in order to understand them, in order to be thought by them, are so deep that they require you letting go of something that you didn't even know you were presupposing, that you stood on, that organized everything, in order to comprehend that thought. And that to me is where listening can be really deeply transformative, right? And it's this kind of yoga of like stepping, like that's why I think why I really enjoy philosophy so much, and especially people like Heidegger, right? Because they never complete, they're not up to finalized sentences, right? They're up to the ride of getting closer and closer to the mystery that can't ever be exemplified fully, right?
Right.
And just the process of of like, it's just beyond comprehension, but there's something there that I don't understand it in order to know, to be interested in it, but somehow something shines forth.
That's
And
right.
in that yoga move of like under going, what is he saying? This thing that you go through when you really engage in that kind of relationship or those kinds of conversations, that it's almost like you're being, it very much feels like you're being birthed by the logos.
Mm-hmm.
In a big way.
That's right. That's right. It's like there's a sliver of light that's sort of emanating through, and that almost disclosed feeling that you're describing of getting there, but never yet. It's like that disclosure is one of the things one of what happens when we cultivate these deeply knowing, beholding and beholden relationships. Mm-hmm. Is that thou becomes a vessel for becomes sort of a proxy for that. You know, it's like there's a as you're speaking about this, especially as you're speaking about sort of this sense of tending to and being dissolved by the act of listening, that somehow there's a dissolution of yourself that happens. Mm-hmm. But then I think in the discourse, when cultivated, there's a resolution to the dissolution, right? Mm. And it's like that there's a tension between dissolution and resolution, and and both happen in the course of that returning to oneself. Mm-hmm. From the passage through thou or by thou. That it's, again, I keep returning to this idea of impregnation, right? Like we're composed of thou, and we keep and we're endlessly being produced, and by we I mean that our knowing and our being known, right?
Yeah.
I don't mean it in an object sense, but I mean ourselves as our knowing and being known is endlessly produced by these impregnations of thou. And there's a deep circularity, and I really want to know. I really want to know in a second from you how you think how commensurate this is with circling and with some of the methods and the axioms behind circling, but that this endless production of knowing. I don't mean production is an unfortunate word because it sort of implies a certain materiality that I don't mean to imply, but creation maybe is a better term. Yeah. Or by this process of impregnation, and then there's this process in the techne of a conversation, mm-hmm. whereby I become thou, and so I become who I am to thou. Mm-hmm. And by that becoming, I see myself more by thou and am the more seen by thou. And so there's this like supersessive uncloaking of persona, but for mutual authentication. Right. And then in behind the persona, as it is uncloaked, it's almost as though there's a hollow that sort of yawns open into that state of revelation. Yeah. And then there's this collapsing together of the knower and the being known into the verbal state, meaning a verbal state of knowing, right? Yeah. You shift into that verbal state. Your being shifts into verbal state, and you identify with the process of knowing by thou, right? And that's why it's this deeply collaborative, mutual becoming process. And what you describe, I think of Heidegger as being taken on a walk, right? The journeying dimension of those discourses, even if the discourses are happening inwardly, which they can, of course, right? As we introject what we have between us, this idea of journeying with the discourse, that the discourse is not sedentary. The discourse, both parties travel in the discourse, but the discourse as a relation also travels. And when you identify with the traveling of the relation, it bears you to, it bears you into, it bears you to places that are otherwise unknowable.
Yeah.
This idea of adventuring, you know.
Yeah. Had that sense of, really got this sense of, you know, the horizon that you can never reach.
Right.
Yet it speaks to that which you can never reach. And yet the horizon is what tells you, like, it gives the ground, the horizon ground. And so there's something about when because there are, and perhaps this is maybe the difference between something like authentic, something like discourse or dialogue in the kind of the authentic mode, right? Versus there's other ways of dialoguing which are more in the inauthentic mode. And I think what we can start to like parse out here a little bit is that it's like, I think what we're talking about is this deep sense in which I'm coming to you and there's a mutual I don't want to say choice, but there's an openness to find myself changed by the dialogue, right?
Right.
Whereas something, I think, like inauthentic dialogue, or, you know, kind of what Heidegger calls idle talk, right?
Uh-huh.
The sense of the ongoing chatter of just mumbling along, you know, gossip and how you doing and all that stuff. And that's what keeps the interpretations of the culture going, right? Is, you would say, is the movement of the social practices and the interpretations move through that discourse and are maintained. And that there's these moments where it's like, if you think about like a foliage or like a, you know, like a vine structure, right? And then something out of that can pop up and sprout, right? And
Right.
and in some way, sometimes it sprouts in such a way that it comes back in and alters what everyone talks about and the way everyone talks about, right? In this very, I'm sure, historically long time frames that no one could put a cause and effect relationship to, right?
Right.
Which is
right.
Yes.
Right. But of course that happens in the span of the macro that we can't hope to digest, but it also happens in the span of the micro within the bounds of a single conversation too. That version of that same process. I thought of fertility. You know, when you said, you know, that there's the ground is generative. The discourse is the encounter is generative of something that emerges as a consequence of the participants submitting themselves to it.
Yes.
Right. And yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That openness to submission.
That's right. That openness to submission. And I think I think that difference again harkens back a little bit to you know a sort of a dichotomized relation between an idolatrous relation and a symbolic relation, right? The idolatrous relation is conceived in thingness, right? To have or not to have, right? And this is where sort of Buber's idea of I, thou, and Fromm's idea of sort of the being and the having modes kind of interlock. Is this idea that we have to shift ourselves into being, which is a fundamentally symbolic shift, in order that we might play through ourselves and be played, right? Play, I think, is the characteristic behavior of symbolic identification, right? Because you neither wholly identify nor wholly disidentify, right? So there's this, you're straddling this interesting bivalent identification. And I think that's what a lot of like really good games train us to do, right? I mean, many people have remarked on this, right? Like that was all what people like Piaget and Vygotsky noted, right, developmentally. But this idea that I think of tabletop games as a good example, right, that you're playing a role in service of a story or an interlocutor in service of a discourse. And you neither fully identify with that role, but you neither fully disidentify from it either. You're playing it in a very important way. And it can become thou to you, just as any of the other characters played can be thou to you, right? And so the thou, the I, thou, reflexively with yourself is deepened and informed and inextricably bound with the I, thou that you strike with other selves, right? Because in some cases they can't be parceled really, right? Because when the identification blends in a symbolic process of knowing, there's a sense of that shared identity that we've been talking about between the knower and the known. So it's like, that's again, that collapsing together. Whereas in that idolatrous relation, it's something that you're holding aloft in front of you, ossified, opaque, right? Not to be seen through. John and Paul recently had a conversation where they were talking,
right? Like not to be seen through. Like what is what is the other option? It's like, it's not to be seen through, but to be opaque so as to carry on.
That's right. To be carried on through, as opposed to an ingredient, that is offered up in service of something altogether new, which isn't dissociated from what entered into the it's not as though these new iterations, these new ascendant iterations, more comprehending iterations of ourselves are dissonant from their antecedent versions, right? There is certainly a continuity. And I guess that's what I mean by the resolution after the dissolution, right? There is a tautness, there is a continuity, which obviously has to be maintained. Otherwise we would probably lose the capacity to function in any continuous manner. But it's the sense of playing with your identity in such a way that that it becomes identical to the process of beholding and being beholden.
Oh, totally. It's really
I
just want to let you know I'm totally enjoying this.
Oh, me too, Guy. Me too.
It's really great. What were you going to say?
I was going to ask you a little bit more specifically about circling, and even as I talk, I find myself doing this, gesturing. Like there's a kinesic temptation just to start circling with my hands, which I'm sure is indicative of something important. But I would just like to, because I've read a little bit on it. I've heard it described by you in other videos and by other people by proxy. But now that we are actually talking, I'm kind of interested in, just based on everything we've been talking about, how does this speak, like this vernacular that we've been speaking in, how does that translate into the vernacular of circling, both in practice and in theory? And I don't know, I'm just so curious about that.
Oh God, yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I have this ongoing dialogue. We've had a few too, like over text with John.
Yeah.
And he was asking me, he was giving me he told me, I love the way you describe circling. Every time you say it, more of it's revealed to me. And that to me is much that, for me anyways, that's like that, and it's heard like that it continually discloses, is very much points to the phenomena itself. And I replied back to him, I think I said something like, sometimes I can't tell if I'm trying to describe circling or if I'm trying to describe being. Sometimes I wonder, like, what am I really describing? But there is this quality of that circling. I kind of think of one of my business partners, Karena. We've been talking a while now about, if we imagine circling as an entity. She said, I think it's a she. And I'm like, it's definitely a she. And it's more like it makes a lot more sense to me, in a poetic sense and a figurative sense of you could say that in circling, the thing that's honed what circling has become as a form and continues to form out of is there's just this sense of like, there's certain things that reveal her to us. And then there's other things that disclose her, right? Like disclose her in other ways. And on some level, it feels like in this some way of like whatever showed itself to us in the original kind of thing that happened at Burning Man with me and my friend Jerry, that just shined forth to us, and we went like this. We're like, what? We didn't know what we were pointing to, what we had just experienced. But on some level, I feel like I've been trying to understand what it is that's been what shined forth that evening, because it keeps yielding more.
Right.
So there is this kind of really almost and John's highlighted this too, because he's noticed it seems like the people who do circling, they end up talking and using these very mystical kinds of almost religious language, but explicitly it's a secular practice, right? There's no like belief claims or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah.
People, as they get into it, they start to have experiences in which they find themselves the only terms that make sense to describe their experience, and how they end up seeing the world through it are these kind of mystical terms.
Right.
So there's just very much about what you've been talking about the pregnancy or the birthing, right? Eros, right? Birthed by, what did you say? Eros birthed by its philios, right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Right. That sense. Yeah. So there's a way in which, in a lot of ways, it has a lot to do with this experience of on one level, it has to do with intimacy. Mm-hmm. It has to do with intimacy, and I think that one of the reasons why circling has actually become very, very big very quickly around the world, which is really something when you think about it.
That must be such a vertiginous experience for you to see this, this practice that had its origin between you and a few other people, like be propelled into this international practice.
So many people had so much to do with that, right? It's like it went beyond Jerry and I, big time. In ways that, like, at a certain point it becomes a little problematic, right? But the essence of it has always been the same, which is this quality of what is it that we're looking at? What is it that we're thinking? What is this thing that's being revealed, such that the presence of it makes me have thoughts I wouldn't have perceptions I wouldn't have, makes me open my heart in ways that I wouldn't ever have opened, that then alters the way that I perceive and relate with everything. So you could say that if the I thou relationship is, like, you could say, the fundamental unit, right, of everything. If you just did a yoga around that and all the machinery and the capacities that it takes to all the asanas that you do to exercise that machinery that creates something like genuine reciprocity, intimacy, listening, deep listening, which I think ultimately that's the real practice, is like a profound kind of deep listening, and how to share in a way that's self-disclosive versus accusatory, right? Being undefended to the moment, being with what is, which is really the heart of the practice, is just being with what is as we are together, and profoundly being with it.
Right.
That has people kind of walk away and relate to their lives in a way that's just like you do in a yoga class, right? Like when you walk out of the yoga class, when you're not thinking about yoga, your baseline is just more open to gravity and balanced and relational. I think the capacities of what it takes to relate to other people are the same capacities that it takes to relate to almost everything, because we're always in a relationship.
That's beautifully put. Right. That's exactly right. We're always in a relationship, and everything is a project. It is a project and product of how that relationship is cast and situated at any given point in consciousness. this idea that you're articulating this, like this inenerrable quality about circling, that it's like the process of circling is the process of discovering what circling is.
Yeah.
This is so neat. That it has it's like the quality, it has an inexhaustible quality to it, that it begs you and beckons you on this ongoing quest that is fulfilling but unfulfilled simultaneously. This idea that it winds itself into territory that is ever disclosing and always to some partial degree unknowable, and that even in the circling gesture, there's a certain beckoning quality to it, that it urges you forward towards it, like a parent walking backwards as the child learns to walk. You know what I mean? Come on. Like that's sort of the image that you're conjuring. Is like circling is a practice of learning to walk, in some sense, learning to know within a certain mode of the term.
And I would say that a lot of the things that you had pointed out and appreciated about qualities that you see in me, that I see in you and experience, just to let you know, I didn't really talk to many people until I was like, 12. I mean, I've
heard you say that, which like just stuns me. I mean, that's so incredible.
There's this other personal quality to it for me where I feel like circling has gathered me, right? As I've been trying to gather it, right? There's this kind of, and in some ways, how I speak and how I listen about, like a lot of that is almost indistinguishable from just being so deeply in these kinds of dialogues and these kind of interactions with people, that in many ways is formed and shaped and drawn out capacities and brought together capacities maybe I already had that had no connection to each other. Like and consolidated into this character called Guy that you're seeing right now.
Right. Into the logos of Guy. Yeah. Right. When you said the word gather, it's like, that's it, right? The gathering, the logos of your particular being. Yeah. It's so neat. And I was going to say something. I just completely lost the thread of it. That's okay. It's gone. Let it go. I know exactly what I was going to say. Came back. Yeah. When I let it go, it came back. Figures, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It was about something you texted to me about how this dialogic process, when serviced, opens us up to, you use the term God seizures, which I thought that was such a great way of saying it.
Oh yeah, in our exchange.
In our text, in our text exchange, you use the term God seizures, and that was brought to mind when you talked about the fact that while circling is an ostensibly secular practice, people can't help but describe their experience in religious terms. And that, of course, that's not surprising at all, because it strikes me, even though it doesn't denominate as such, it strikes me as a deeply religious practice, for all the reasons that we've talked about. Carl Jung had on one of his studies, one of his houses back in the day in Switzerland had a quote inscribed. I think it was attributed to Erasmus, but I can't be sure of that. But it was a quote above his study that said, "Called or not, God will be present." So this idea that mutual revelation opens up to the presence of ultimacy, right? The sense of ultimate disclosure, which is, I think, in some sense what we mean when we invoke the namesake, is an interesting way of understanding some of the purpose of the practice.
Yeah.
That it is inspired, that we aspire in the process to be inspired by it, in the sense of that, again, it catches that breathing metaphor, which I find is so evocative of intimate encounters, that sense of mutual respiration, right? And it also helps to depict more viscerally what befalls us when we can't get access to that, when we aspire and can't actually draw breath, which is, again, this idea of the unrequited love or the unrequited eros, not being able to gain intersubjective traction with a philia practice, not being properly embedded communally, is this aspiration without respiration, defined by lack. So the idea that there is a respiring quality to the circling that avails the presence of the presence of revelation, mutual revelation, and general revelation. And what you said about it opening the group, opening the participants to God seizure, is a fascinating way of putting it. Martin Buber, who talked about the I, thou, and the I, I think said something like, I, thou brings the mind to God. Right, the mind is brought to God by thou. And it sounds like in some sense, among other things, what the way you're describing circling is what it's doing is it's a okay, let's see this where I'm going to borrow from Heidegger a little bit. I think it's like a conjugal clearing of being.
Conjugal clearing of being. Yeah.
Right. It's
conjugal meaning together.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Clearing of being. Yeah.
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 Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that.
What about it? What about it really? There's something about it where I get the sense in the way that you're struck by it and the quality of like your interest and fascination in it, and your curiosity. I get the sense that it's almost like, tell me if this is true. It's almost like there's something going on with what you want, your understanding about circling, that is somehow gathering something in front of you that you were already thinking about in some way, but then it's one of those things that you until that was gathered that you didn't even know you were thinking about it, but it was yeah.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think it has accessed what I think is a persistent and kind of a long-standing interest that I've had, but I think you've given it something of a more tangible shape. And in talking to you and in coming to learn about this, I have yet to do it, I should say. I have yet to do it formally, but I intend to, and I'm looking forward to doing it.
Yeah, totally.
But what it has accessed is this, again, this lingering suspicion that, sort of what we were talking about before, this lingering suspicion that the enchantment of the world that is often now unavailable to us because we've lost the symbolic grammar to elocute it properly, that sense of being imbued with spirit, mutually imbued with spirit, is present in those most intimate and this most disclosing conversations in a way that it is absent in almost, for me, most of the remainder of life's habits. And, that's really part of what I mean when I say I could, when I feel composed of meaningful conversations, like I mean it thoroughly. Because when I think back, a handful or more, perhaps at this point it's more than a handful, but those conversations take on this, they take on this enchanted quality such that, they seem to be somehow blessed, right? And time, which is usually such a despot in our lives, even time starts to sort of slows to linger on them. And they take on this sense of pregnancy, as though there's a recreation of the self through them. Like they take on such importance. And I've been impressed by how prominently they have figured, for me, how prominently they have figured in my reflexive understanding of myself, my understanding of other people, my understanding of what activities are truly meaningful and worthwhile. And so that, I think that natural interest, and that educated interest in the potential of meaningfully cultivated discourse.
Yeah.
It's something that now I think is turning from a sort of a latent observation, or sort of a nascent interest, into something that I feel more and more compelled to practice, and more compelled to materialize in a way that I can be perhaps more, a little bit more directly inquisitive about, with it, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It just makes a lot of sense of especially in the way that, well, a couple of things. I got the same feeling that when you pointed to this in this conversation, that when you talked about the dying star of Christianity, that was just that when you said that, I thought about that in the way, mostly the felt sense of what was communicated in what you said, along with what you said, but the felt sense just jiggled something in me just jiggled again when you talked about it. This sense of that, oh, actually, it's one of what I heard you say is one of the few places in the world, right, that still you could be struck and birthed and mutually birthed in a way that you couldn't predict ahead of time, right?
Yes.
You could still,
That's
you're still
exactly
available. There's a way in which you keep that none of your propositions can deny the experience that you just had, because there's so few places left in the world that have that kind of God sees your potential, right?
Yes. That presence, that sense of presence. That's not simply your presence, and not simply the presence of the person opposite you, but a greater sense of presence, like a cosmic presence, right? Yeah. And I think that speaks to this idea of the God seizure, right? Is that you are shone, and there is a shining through the conversation. That it takes on a kind of importance, a kind of significance that is beyond you, that you will spend a great deal of time trying to then grow into.
Like the thing that's happening now?
Yeah, like the thing that's happening now. Yeah, exactly.
When you said that, beyond you, and I think you went with that, right?
I
felt that. I was just like, there is a beyondness. There is something showing.
Yeah, there totally is. And so impressive is it that, again, when I think back to my own memories, and the way that my time and sense of narrative has been marked and divided into its respective chapters, that those conversations, those discourses, and the intimacy of those discourses are more constitutive of who I am now than the sum of the most exotic experiences, the whatever accomplishments or feats or adventures, I've been lucky enough to be in some very beautiful places and to see some wondrous things. And I've, but somehow those quiet, intimate, revelatory conversations are more significant than cumulatively than anything that could be called adventurous or exotic at face value. And I think coming to recognize that honestly, seeing that for what it is, and acknowledging it, I think for me is significant. Right. Because it's sort of like it's identifying something about this is sacred, and I mean that in the full technical proper sense of the term. They are sacred. Okay, why are they sacred? Right. Yeah. What about why? What is engendered by these conversations that is otherwise is lacking in much of the rest of life. So I think that's why you're right. You intuited it precisely, but that's why this circling and the way you've described it and the way that I've heard it described up to now seems to presume what I have taken time to realize, which is that there is something about the authenticating experience of being so known to oneself in the care of being beholden by others that imbues a realization of the sacred in a way that we seldom have access to in the present.
As I just really noticed natural slowing and deepening of the pace. And I felt as much, and I found myself listening to that as at the cadence and the pace and the slowerness and the stillness I kind of felt consolidated in listening to you. I feel so much more closer into my skin, right? And closer to you at the same time. Just in the I think what I heard in that slowness was something more showed itself in the words that you said. And one of the things that struck me was when you said, you kind of made a distinction between, it's taken something to recognize that it's been these sometimes quiet yet deep moments of intimacy with another, right? Where I come to knowledge of myself in the care of the other, right? In ways that although I've lived a really cool life, and there's been a lot of really great experiences, I've come to be honest I've had to be honest with myself about that. I sensed a journey. Right?
Yes.
Like a personal journey, like a sense of like a personalness in your own life in just making that distinction. I felt it.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Say more.
You're so perceptive. I love the way you do that. It's great. Yes. Yeah. You're quite right. You're quite right. Yeah.
It feels like I'm getting your world.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think you were disposed to get it at the outset, but I think that, you have an uncanny knack for being able to cotton on to the, like, your attention to the cadence of speech and all, you have I understand this is, I can see easily how readily you nurture conversation, and that you can fan it in the right way, or you can dim it in the right way. There's clearly a deftness of hand that you have, with guiding the process and noticing and pronouncing certain things, for that beg attention. But
that's what circling, I think, as a practice ongoingly, being available to notice those moments that shine forth, that are sometimes really quiet, but as you said, I love the way that you put this, coming to know myself in another, in the presence of care. That part, the care, is that's the thing. More than anything, that I think practicing circling has been a practice of giving myself over to deep care, and coming of care in a genuine way. Because I think it's only because as we've been having this conversation, I just found myself caring about you. I'm like, so it's like the genuineness.
Likewise.
Me, and there's I'm like, you're mattering to me, and it's almost what I'm noticing is indistinguishable from caring about you as it's happening. So noticing different things is all about, seems to presuppose just a deep care that's cultivated in me for sure, yet arises for me spontaneously with you.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
That's really, I would say, is the hand, right? Is the hand
Yeah.
kind of some kind of primordial care.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's, yeah. You mentioning the hand actually, and it reminds me of something I think you said in your conversation with Paul.
Huh?
You were talking about the evolved relationship between our hands and motor functions and our frontal lobes, which was a neat connection. And it actually, that was brought to mind a few weeks ago. I was thinking about you. I was at a wedding a couple of weeks ago, a friend's wedding, and I was in the ceremony, not partaking of it, but watching it, partaking of it by watching it. And there was an interesting little gesture that is sometimes officiated at weddings, but not always. And the officiate asks the bride and the groom to lock hands, for one to take the other's hands, and then sort of went on at some length about how their interlocking hands symbolize their mutual commitment and the potential of their life together. Now, we're so accustomed to seeing this, right, that it's so easy to glance right over it and to think it commonplace. But I was thinking about it in more detail. I was paying more attention to the symbolic language of the ceremony than I think I usually do. And again, your comment about this was sort of top of mind, the significance of that gesture, that haptic gesture of the mutual clasping of the hands. Again, and that to me, it struck me in that moment in a way that it never had before, that the interlocking hands, and again, having the I-thou relation in mind when I say this, that the interlocking hands is perhaps the most elegant expression of philia and the overlay of philia over eros that I could conceive of. John and I often talk about the kiss as being sort of a canonical symbolic expression of eros, and it's a very powerful symbol, the kiss, and it's this drive for mergence, right? And it's an enacted drive for mergence that is instantiated by the act of the kiss. But there's something about the interlocking hands that represented and affected what was also happening more broadly in the ceremony, which is that eros is embedded within philia, and that philia is actually, it literally, not literally, of course, but I wish I had a better word for it, but really symbolically encloses the couple, because they are now embedded within family, right? So at the center, there's this eros that is transformed into a mutual conformity, right? A mutual being of identification, and a mutual becoming. And of course, the hands are in many ways a more interesting symbolic conveyance of that than the kiss, because the hands come with all kinds of dexterity and creative power and potential that the kiss just can't quite match, right? So there's something in the variability of the hands and their multitude of functions, their multitude of creative potential that couches the eros within that philia. And then around the couple, they are then inculcated by this familial gathering. And you're into your discussion with Paul, I think Paul said something which I thought was also just beautifully put, which is that the sacrament of the wedding, and that's exactly what, I mean, a sacrament is a symbolic transmutation, right, of sorts. And the sacrament of the wedding is the process of making a family member from a non-family member, right? Growing a person by virtue of that person being known now. Wow. And so there was something about the clasping of the hands, right? The education of the erotic instinct by the philia, and the way that was also synchronously, the way that was also modeled by the way that the ceremony is organized, right? And they're ringed hands too, right? At this point, they have rings on them, which is also significant for the same reason. And then, and it comes back to this idea of the arrangement of loves, that the procession, that the sort of the processual ceremony of a wedding is a ritual way of symbolically arranging our loves such that they fall mutually reinforcing into the right order, right? The eros enveloped within philia that molds it and figures it and graduates it. And then, of course, from that, just as the pregnancy yields the birth, there's this agapic creation of persons, creation of family as a consequence of that.
Wow.
And so it was like, I was sitting in this wedding. I've been to so many weddings, and I'm sitting there, and for the first time, and I'd thought about this. I mean, John lectures a little bit on this about some of these symbols too. And it's not, it's all wasn't produced from nothing, but it was the first time I had actually sat in a wedding, taken all of this in, and realized that there was this incredibly elegant, deeply penetrating symbolic order, this procession, this concerto of loves that were ringed, in a certain formation, and that formation was about the creation of persons in the knowing of persons and in the mutual conformity of knowing. So that was, and anyway, much of this was precipitated by your comment about the hands and about our brains and the way that, haptic gestures are exacted into, some of the functions that allow us to symbolize in the first place. And so there's this deep, deep, deep connection, right, between the clasping of hands and the function of hands and this capacity that we have to do that. But it all just sort of fell into this very elegant place for me before my eyes in a way that I don't think I had noticed it before. And anyway, I wanted to relay, even in a premeditated way, I wanted to relay that to you because your what you said in that conversation figured very, very prominently, and that's a series of thoughts that unfolded on that particular day.
Wow. See that right there. So right there. So there's a way in which an example of a penetration of each other, right? Of like something I said in a video, right? That somehow was connected to you getting this wedding and seeing it another way, that we're then now talking about it, right? Mm-hmm. That was based on a conversation that you were listening to with somebody else. This is that invisible movement of what I'm really interested in. And in some way we'll never quite know exactly, just like, well, the fact of language, who knows who the inventor of that was, right? Like, there's an antiquity to it, right? A letting go of it, but a way that it just brings, there's something about these dialogues that is bringing something forward in a way that's I'm noticing it's having me have even more reverence for it and more, like you said, humility, and one sense, like a deep humility, by virtue of the structure of it, and at the same time, like a breadth of the possible scope, right? That a place where technology doesn't lead to further enframetment, but maybe leads to the appreciation and the cultivation of something beyond frames, right?
That's right.
And as you were talking too, there was this moment where I was just like, I looked down and I looked at my wedding ring, and I was also listening to because my wife and I got married about 9-10 months ago. It's been
really that recently.
It's been we've been with each other for a long time. We've been with each other for about 8 years, I think, 8 or 9 years. With like a year and a half in between where we went together. And I have been so struck actually by how totally transformed, I feel,
Ha,
by being wedded. I
that's
had
cool.
no idea. I thought, I mean, mostly I just thought it was formality, right? This is
Yep,
what
yep.
we do. And, but to find myself in this ritual of a
Right,
wedding that feels alive, and
right.
I think how I described it yesterday, it's as if it felt like being married, felt like it took the right thing and put it the right thing in the center of the mandala, and then
Ha,
once it slipped in, it did like an ontological chiropractic adjustment
ha,
to everything
ha.
else. Because my relationship with the world is different, like how I
Right,
feel about
right.
my
You
old,
know the world wedded. Yeah, it's
yeah,
like it's like wedded becomes a way of knowing,
yeah,
through your weddedness,
right.
something like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
That's cool.
there's kind of a way in which it's somehow present in with both of us, where we're having conversations that it. She even said the other day, she's like, "Wow, we just made it through that conversation. That wouldn't have happened before, right?"
Huh.
And then she said something really telling. She's like, "I think our relationship, our marriage, is officially more mature than us." Because there is this quality of that there's something that actually I do feel like it has
Right,
experience
right,
of being held by something that's so obviously deeper, more pointing to something more greater than
right,
it has me restructure. And even I think she would say restructure all the way down to how we perceive what is and isn't important,
right,
right?
right.
It's so as you're talking about that, and I've just
Ah, it's like it sounds like if I mean I'm sort of borrowing this very a term that's of course steeped in Christian sacrament, but I'm doing so deliberately. It sounds to me like what you're describing is that the wedding, the ritual of marriage was like a transubstantiation of your relationship. That's
yes.
kind of what it sounds
Yeah.
like.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And in some ways, it consolidated what was already coming to form.
Right, right. Consummated it, like
Yeah.
in the sense of
Right.
like, the
Yeah.
perfecting, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. Right. And like now I never thought I would find myself wanting to have more children at 47. Right. But I'm like, I want all of them. Right. There's something. It's I'm
Right,
wanting things that I didn't want. Things are occurring to
right,
me that
right.
very, very differently. And what's interesting is there's something about being not of that world, right? Because I never had like my, I come from a background where it was not stable at all. Right?
Right,
There's like lots of addiction and all kinds of stuff, right? So
right,
not like I had something like secure attachment. So
right.
in many ways, what I feel like in some of this is just simply I I I kind of find myself coming into this. What I think happens in many ways culturally, well, I don't know anymore culturally, but like
Mm,
historically, the marriage and all the symbolic, all the things that you pointed to, right? The plumbing of that, um, the impact of that, because I don't expect it or I didn't anticipate it, it's occurring to me like on some level, I'm just talking about having conservative values, but it's not. But like on some level, like just kind of given to some, you could say
yeah,
conservative values or something like that.
sure. Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm experiencing it like this is profound. I'm finding
Yeah,
myself being different, and so there's something
right.
about everything that you just said and the depth of what you said, right? And the personal felt quality of imagining you, right? Imagining the wedding, finding itself in your listening, right? In your eyes, with that kind of depth of understanding where I felt almost like the wedding spoke right through my wedding ring and like led
Ha.
all this.
Which is the function of the symbol, is for it to speak.
Yes,
It's to
yes,
speak endlessly through your wedding ring.
yes.
Yes, the Warren symbol, the motioning of the Warren symbol is the endless repetition, the recreation of that ceremony, of that sacrament.
Yeah.
it's reproductions in you. And
Totally. Thank you for being in my wedding.
My pleasure. Thank you for sharing your wedding with me.
Yeah.
That's so neat. But neat doesn't even it's moving. It's moving to me
Yeah,
to hear
I
that.
feel
It
moved
really is.
with you.
It really, really is moving for me to hear that. And I was thinking to myself on this particular day that I attended this wedding, I was thinking to myself, like, when I was younger, weddings did not get to me. You know, I looked forward to the food and the dancing and, you know, maybe the open bar, but I didn't really feel, it's only recently that I've find myself moved by weddings in this way. And when I started to really contemplate it and try and understand it, I mean, it's so obvious, of course, now it's so obvious because the symbolic depth of that ritual, like it's, and that's why, you know, I know that we live in a world now where it's dismissed out of hand fairly often, and, you know, people have their apprehensions and their reasons, and I'm always, because of my reverence for symbolic grammar and the archetypal proxies for that grammar, right, in our familial, the vessels of our familial connections, right? Mother and father, agape, brother, sister, philia, right? Husband, wife, lover, eros. The way the wedding integrates these into a concert is so moving. And of course it's moving because these connections are inmost to us. How could it not be? But I find that the significance of that ritual, because it's been, I think, tinged with apprehensions related to, you know, religious participation writ large, is dismissed out of hand very often as being a pro forma exercise, as you say. And I can't speak with any authority on it because I've never been married, and so I can't know in my bones that transformation. But looking out at it, that suspicion has lived within me increasingly over the course of time, that there is something about the symbolic transmutation that changes the figuration of that relationship. It must. These symbols, even though our relation to these semiotic proxies, these familial connections, has been vitiated a little bit over time, and even though it's attenuated, you know, because our symbolic grammar has attenuated, there's enough still there to move us. There's certainly enough still there to move me. And hearing you describe it in such a deeply and beautiful, visceral way, it's moving for its own sake, but it's also moving for the way it informs this suspicion that I've had about what a wedding does to people, and what comparable rituals do to people, right? It's not just a wedding. Philosophia has a similarly transformative quality insofar as, right, the relationship between eros and philia, right, in a very different setting, in a very different context. It's fascinating.
Totally.
That's fast. Thank you for sharing that with me. I really thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's really great sharing with you. The sense of one of the things you talked about with Paul too that really struck me, and it kind of, I think it figures here as we're talking, is this sense in which you talk about, like, you know what, although I grew up Catholic, I didn't realize how Catholic I actually was until I started to get older. And you see it, you recognize it coming out. There's some sense in ways that you realize, like, oh, you recognize as you get older, right? I don't know if you see it and it wasn't there before, or if you just recognize it or something like that. But there was a couple levels that I appreciated on it. Was one is to that would really be something to recognize that. Like, I got this sense that it's a deep recognition, that it's like comes from the ground floor in some way.
That's exactly right.
That was the sense. But also it also pointed to me, and I think I even kind of texted John about this. I was like, oh yeah, I want to remember this, because it seems to point to something where, like, the place or the level or the loci of where something like religion actually lives, right? The level of depth, it not being this conscious debate about what's true or not true, but it being
Right. Yeah.
thing that organizes one, that one can be without knowing it and then find out, right?
That's right. That's right. That it is something that isn't true or false, but rather realized or unrealized.
Yeah. And I just had this sense, I was wondering, just being moved by topic one, being at a wedding and being newly struck by a wedding and it coming together and remembering that, revering that, and then sharing about the impact of me sharing about your wedding and being so moved by it. That your personal responsiveness, right, in being breathed in a way or struck by that, is that speaking to what you mean when you say, oh, I didn't realize how Catholic I am?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think part of what I meant by that is I started to notice my response to being symbolically provoked by certain demonstrative rituals or certain narratives. You know, I could feel myself becoming provoked by revisiting the sight of symbols that I had perhaps known as a kid or at a younger age, but finding them vivid in a way that I hadn't before. Seeing them at a different level of resolution. So there's that. I feel symbolically provoked more and more frequently by the way in which especially by the motions of the sagacious figures, right? Like, I mean, like Christ and Socrates. I remember those move me, and I think much of what estranged me from it when I was younger, and still estranges me from certain kinds of participation, is that idolatrous quality that I was describing of our sociability, which I think is also true of the way that religious knowing has been misclassed and placed unduly into object taxonomies. You know, it has been subject to a number of category mistakes, I think, and it has been misplaced. And I think that gets to what you were saying about the fact that it's not here, it's here. And, well, it's, you know what I mean when I make those gestures. And it's like we've been I'm trying to get it's like I've realized that sort of like an adolescent can mistake his father for his friend, that kind of category mistake. Like, I've been looking across at this rather than up at it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
That it is constitutive of me. I am composed of religious compounds.
Yeah.
That act through me,
in
care of me, and in care of my relations, that I have but to realize in order for them to espouse their proper significance. This brings to mind, I heard, there's a little excerpt of a poem from W.H. Auden that I heard once that like just blew me back because it articulated this so succinctly. And it goes something like this: we are lived by the powers we pretend to understand. They arrange our loves. It is they who direct at the end the enemy bullet, the sickness, or even our hand. This idea of being lived, just as you say, being breathed,
Yeah.
And this idea, that's where I get this idea of arranging our loves, right? That the sacramental ordering of symbols is the sacramental ordering of loves, right? Into to a configuration that avails us and avails our knowing and being known. That I feel myself increasingly lived by an orientation that I have come to listen to and abide more and more and more, and with less self-consciousness and with more vulnerability and with fewer sort of being able to sidestep some of the apprehensions that come with adolescence and the egocentrism that comes with a lot of that, the fear of maintaining oneself and one's brand. Once I was able to get, I mean, that's an ongoing project in some sense, but I think once I was able to get over myself, to get over this idea of being fixed in a certain, of having my nature fixed in a certain way, and understood myself as a project of unveiling, as a project of realization, then I gave myself license to allow things that were of a more unconscious valence to come forth and to shine through. And part of that is, just as we were talking about, cultivating relationships that have a way of being incisive, just like you were doing with me earlier, by noticing things that perhaps I might not have noticed of myself. And of course, I've tried to provide the same kind of service, obviously, for other people. But I think that's one thing we do for each other, is we provide that service of helping to pronounce things about one another that we see through and that go unseen by us. And so I think cultivating relationships like the one I had with John, I mean, it was John's, and I think you had a similar experience. I think I remember you saying this. It was John's discussion, his exegesis of agape, way back when I first met him, whenever that was, 10, almost 10 years ago now, that, like, I think took a lot of this dormant attachment, these constitutive compounds, right, that compose the gut of my religious predilections. They all just came bubbling up. Like, they just came bursting out like that, because it was all of a sudden, because the grammar was there, right? The symbolic grammar was communicated properly. And of course, it was a perfect match for those sort of archetypal convictions that for a long time lay unspoken because they couldn't be spoken. They had to be spoken and heard and spoken by the proper grammar.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that these loves give us, and the symbols for these loves give us, is they give us the grammar to be able to inflect those inward convictions that otherwise will inevitably appear, will appear with other names, right? They'll surface with other names, but if they're spoken to properly, if they're called out properly, they will take their authentic form, I think. And so that's what I think a great teacher does. Of course, John is my canonical example of that. That's what good pedagogy does, I think. Good religious and philosophic pedagogy is it provides the grammar to figure to arrange our loves, right? That, like, to take what we already know to be true and to elocute it, and to give it its proper geometry, to finesse it, and so I think that's really what I think that's what kind of there have been a few instances like that where there has been an awakening of an awakening of realization about what I namelessly knew to be true, or to be real is probably a better way of saying it. But certainly meeting John was probably chief among them. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question at all. I just sort of meandered, but I guess that's okay. I guess that's what we're doing.
Meandering, right? Like, I'm definitely enjoying it. Well, one of the things that really struck me about what you were saying was that something, as you started to come to know yourself less as a thing, right? As an ego that was fixed, and you started to awaken to that you're a process of transformation, right?
Exactly.
That there was something at a certain point you started to look at, in some ways, religious symbols that you grew up with, but they shine forth to you were able to see them. And in seeing them, there was something, it sounds like it put skin on the ghost of these inner.
Yes.
Right? Like,
beautiful way of putting it. Yes.
Right? And
yes.
But what's interesting to me about this is what I feel traveling along with you as you're speaking this, and as this has been coming to you, the atmosphere around it, is that there's something important, it seems, about it, that when you put the skin on the ghost, there was the recognition of that, oh, wow, I'm kind of made for this on some level.
Yeah.
But there was also the recognition, it seems implied in the atmosphere of the insight, is what I'm hearing, is that I hadn't seen it. Like that got disclosed as well, I would imagine. In this, I'm looking at the most familiar thing. I'm looking at the cross or whatever, right? And then
precisely.
Whoa. Like,
there it is.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're able to see, it was able to reach you in some way.
That's right.
Then there's also this, I think, here's the aletheia part, I would imagine, which is because I thought about this, the event of unconcealment, right?
Yes.
I always, for years, I just assumed that when aletheia, the lake of forgetfulness, right? So aletheia, forgetfulness. Aletheia was about what's revealed. But actually, no, what's revealed is concealment.
Yes.
Concealedness. So there's the quality of that, echoing of that in what you're talking about, of just seeing, because what the mood of it feels something like it revealed, concealed.
Exactly. It to Heidegger's unconcealment, I would also pair Plato's recollection, because for me it was the realization of affinity, the reverence for the symbol was the realization of affinity with it. I was mutually informed by it and was known by it, just as I could then know it. It was like I realized how much of it was already in behind much of my experience, was already creative of so much of who and what I was, that it's a revelation of parentage, in a sense. That's right. It's a revelation of parentage. It's a revelation of origin and fundamental constitution. It's like I'm made of this. I'm moved by this because I'm made of this in some sense, right? So there's something like a familiar, and again, I mean this symbolically, but that means I mean it as real. There is something like a familial reunion about returning to those symbols, there's a returning home. There's a sense of returning to origin, not in some kind of romantic, sense, but a realization of the realization of like the ground of my being in some sense bottoms out at these symbols.
Yeah.
And that's just like, and they tell me that, it's just an intuition of the encounter that is true.
Right.
And I suspect that that's true of us in our respective, in our respective clothing. That is true of us all generally. We're composed by these symbols, right? We have been for a very, 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 very long time. And for me, having a Catholic background, which I think I said to Paul was kind of, I'm glad to have had it because it sowed a lot of religious vocabulary and a certain amount of biblical literacy, not near enough, but enough, that when then I re-encountered it in the hands of more adroit pedagogy later in life, I could start to make match. I could start to make match with it. And it, but it was the revelation of the, it was the realization of being constituted by these symbolic compounds. Yeah. And then encountering them was encountering myself. Right. Because that's what they do. They encounter yourself, right? You encounter yourself in them and through them, because in playing them through, you are so birthed, as it were. So yeah, this idea of recollection, this idea of being pronounced by, I think in some sense that's what's intimated by this idea of the divine double, right? Or maybe if I was to return to that metaphor about, that dying star, it's that, the dying star has correspondent embers within each of us, right? And it's without, but it's also within. It's again, it's drawn by relation. It's cast within us in relation always. There's always a tension.
That sense of at some point you become pregnant with the perception. This is what I basically hear you see. It's not like you thought of something. It's more like you saw something. Like you're looking at something, and it has this quality of being impressed, like literally impressed, impregnated with it. But then there's this quality of the birth being this recognition of, this is what has impregnated me, is what I have been of the whole time. That it exactly. So in some sense, it is a self-impregnation. I think Kierkegaard had a metaphor like that, where he talked to like this, which sounds, it sounds egoistic, but of course it's not, because it's only egoistic if what we mean by the self is that stunted object, right? But of course it's not. What we mean by the self is this processual becoming, and taken in that definition, that's exactly what it is. It is self-impregnation and self it is self-impregnation and rebirthing, and that the idea that it happens in the care of thou, as we've been saying, is also crucial to all of this. It's crucial to the matter, because the symbol is thou, right? Right. So when we start to sort of parcel the symbols more specifically, it gets difficult to unpack without
without it gets difficult to parcel in its grains. But I think I think that's right. I think that's right.
Yeah, it's like it's almost like its difficultness to parcel is itself revealing.
Yeah, it bucks a certain kind of examination.
Yeah,
it has to be known in such a way and not known in others.
Yeah.
Right? It's difficult, but
totally. Well, it's just in some ways, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about just, what if we really look at the structure of a conversation taken seriously, an authentic conversation.
Yeah.
And we think of this. I feel like something deep rumble in me. Like in some way, I can feel the sense of like, oh, all those moments with all those people, like all the moments of getting somebody's world and feeling everything shake and mutually, and all those moments this is getting right at the structure of those moments in a very big way. That's having me start to think about what we started talking about right at the beginning. What are we doing when we're like,
the
screens? There's something deeply hermeneutic
yes
about this, right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
That sense of where what's doing the talking, what we're talking about is what's doing the talking. That sense of where substance is,
what we're talking about is what's doing the talking. I like that. What we're talking about is what's doing the talking. And then we are being talked, just as we are being lived, just as we are being breathed.
Ourselves being talked by the conversation, and then not.
Yes. Because the conversation, the relation of the conversation is like an entity unto itself, right? And it's the relation that becomes the symbol. And I think that's actually what we mean when we say someone is a symbol. I don't think that's quite right. I think what we really mean is it's the I, thou that is the symbol. It's the pairing. It's the erotic and philia pairing of the relation that is the symbol itself. That entity of that relation, that synthesis, I think Kierkegaard called it a synthesis of spirit, is really what we mean by the symbol, the evolving project.
Yes.
All right, that's the projected. That's what is projected, is the relation.
Yeah.
And that relation becomes us as we become that relation.
That seems worth going to.
I think so.
That's dope. That's worth going.
That is dope.
Yeah, that's dope.
That's dope.
I actually have to. I completely lost track of time. I have to.
It's okay. So did I. That's all right. I got a jet too.
So good. This conversation really, really impacted me deeply. Like,
me too, Guy.
Just that whole thing that we were talking about, just the recognition of your own constituents, what you're constituted by. And I feel that deep constitution in you in a very, very articulate, genuine, personal way that's really stunning. So in many ways I feel shaped by this conversation. I know I'm going to be walking with it.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Guy. And I have to say, like, I'm not, I have not been inclined. I mean, it occurs to me now that I've only just met you. It doesn't feel like that at all. I've been disinclined to entrust many people and many conversations with this kind of intimacy. But you begged that confidence and that trust implicitly in everything you say and do. And so I'm so grateful to have had the chance to chat with you. I hope we can chat again. Yes. I'd love to.
Oh yeah, guaranteed. You're not getting away.
All right. Back at you.
All right. Mwah.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Guy.
Yes.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.